I never thought my 25-year career as a commercial pilot would end with an explosion that nearly scared me to death. My name is Robert Mitchell, but everyone calls me Bob. I'm 52 years old and have been a captain for one of America's major airlines for over 2 decades. I've flown to every continent, faced storms that would make anyone pray, and thought I'd seen everything in aviation. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on flight AA447 from Dallas to Miami on a Tuesday in March that changed my life forever. It was an ordinary day, one of those that starts way too early and you barely have time for a decent cup of coffee before heading to the airport. My wife, Linda, was still sleeping when I left home at 4 in the morning. I left a note in the kitchen saying I'd arrive in Miami in the afternoon and would call as soon as I landed. If I had known what was coming, I would have woken her up to say I loved her. The crew briefing was routine. I was flying with First Officer Jake Rodriguez, a 34-year-old I'd always admired for his competence and calm under pressure. Jake had about 4,000 flight hours, a solid pilot I trusted completely. Our cabin crew consisted of 5 experienced flight attendants led by Chief Flight Attendant Sarah Thompson, a 15-year veteran who knew every inch of that Boeing 767-300ER. "Captain, weather looks good all the way to Miami," Jake said as we reviewed the meteorological data. "Favorable winds, no significant turbulence forecast. Should be a smooth flight." How wrong I was. Our 767 was loaded with 180 passengers and 12 crew members. It was an aircraft I knew like the back of my hand. I'd flown this same plane dozens of times. Tail number N847AA, a robust machine with an impeccable maintenance record. 2 Pratt & Whitney JT9D 7R4 engines, each capable of generating 48,000 pounds of thrust. A reliable aircraft that had taken me around the world without ever letting me down. Boarding proceeded normally, families heading to Disney World, executives traveling on business, some American tourists fulfilling their dream of visiting Miami. Among the passengers was a high school from Phoenix, taking 35 students on a cultural exchange to Miami. Seeing those excited young people reminded me of my own kids and how aviation can make dreams come true. At 7:15 a.m. Central Time, we initiated pushback from Gate 14 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The day was clear, with unlimited visibility and calm winds. Conditions were perfect for takeoff on runway 18R. DFW ground, American 447 Heavy, taxi to runway 18 right via taxiway Bravo, I transmitted over the radio. American 447 Heavy, taxi runway 18 right via Bravo, contact ground 121.9. We switched to ground control frequency and received instructions to proceed. During taxi, we completed all pre-takeoff checklists. The engines responded perfectly. All systems showed normal. V1 rotate, Jake announced when we reached decision speed on takeoff. I gently pulled back on the yoke, and our 767 left Texas soil at 7:32 a.m. It was a perfect takeoff, with the aircraft climbing consistently through the morning cloud layers. Within minutes, we were en route over the Gulf of Mexico, heading southeast. "Gear up," I commanded, and Jake retracted the landing gear. We climbed to our initial cruise altitude of 35,000 feet, where we would settle in for the 2.5-hour flight to Miami. The flight plan would take us over the Gulf of Mexico, then along Florida's west coast to Miami. The first hour and 40 minutes of flight were absolutely normal. We talked about our families, future plans, and Jake told me about his studies to become a captain. He had everything it takes to be an excellent pilot in command, technical knowledge, good judgment, and most importantly, the humility to keep learning. The passengers were relaxed. Some were sleeping, others watching movies on the individual entertainment systems. The cabin service had been served without problems, and I received only compliments from the crew about passenger behavior. It was exactly the kind of flight every pilot wants. No incidents, no complications. We were flying over the Gulf of Mexico, about 200 nautical miles southwest of Tampa, and still far from any alternate airport, when everything changed. It was exactly 9:17 a.m. Central Time. I was reviewing our position on the flight management computer when I heard a sound I'll never forget. It was like someone had detonated a bomb inside the right engine. Bang! The entire aircraft shook violently. Immediately, alarms began sounding in the cockpit like a symphony from hell. Master caution, engine failure, fire warning. Red and yellow lights flashed across the instrument panel. "What was that?" Jake shouted, his hands automatically going to the controls. I looked out the right side window and felt my blood freeze. Where our right engine should have been running perfectly, there was now an apocalyptic sight. The engine was literally tearing itself apart. Enormous pieces of metal were flying in all directions, some hitting the wing and fuselage with crashes that sounded like cannon shots. "Engine failure, announced the aircraft's warning system. But this was more than a simple engine failure. It was a catastrophic explosion that was destroying our aircraft in real time. "Jake, I have the aircraft," I shouted, firmly gripping the yoke. The plane began to become uncontrollable. With the total loss of right engine power and the structural damage I could see spreading across the wing, we were facing a situation far beyond a standard emergency. "Emergency checklist! Engine failure severe!" I shouted to Jake. But before we could begin any procedure, something even worse happened. I heard a sharp, frightening sound. Air being sucked out of the cabin. "Depressurization!" Jake yelled. The cabin was losing pressurization rapidly. At about 35,000 feet altitude, we had only seconds before lack of oxygen would begin affecting our ability to think and make decisions. "Oxygen masks," I commanded. We put on our oxygen masks quickly. Throughout the aircraft, passenger masks had deployed automatically, and I could hear through the interphone Sarah instructing passengers with her firm, professional voice. "Attention passengers, this is your flight attendant. Please place the oxygen mask over your nose and mouth, breathe normally, and remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." But our situation was deteriorating every second. Through the window, I could see it wasn't just the engine that had exploded. Fragments from the explosion had pierced the fuselage in multiple places. It was clear we had punctures in the aircraft's pressurized structure. "Captain, we need to descend immediately," Jake said, his voice muffled by the oxygen mask. He was right. With the cabin depressurized, our number one priority was to descend to an altitude where we could breathe without oxygen masks, below 10,000 feet. "Emergency descent," I announced on the radio. "Miami Center, American 447 Heavy, declaring Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Severe engine failure with cabin depressurization, requesting immediate descent to flight level 10,000. American 447 Heavy, Miami Center, roger your Mayday. Descend immediately and maintain flight level 10,000. State souls on board and fuel remaining. 447 Heavy, 192 souls on board," I replied, fighting to keep the aircraft stable while initiating an emergency descent. But when I went to check our fuel quantity, I received another shock that almost made me let go of the controls. Our fuel tanks were leaking dramatically. What should have been about 15,000 pounds of fuel for the remainder of the flight had dropped to only 4,000 pounds and was continuing to decrease rapidly. "Jake, look at the fuel." His eyes widened when he saw the numbers on the displays. "My God, we're losing fuel very fast. With this rate of consumption and leakage, we have at most 15 minutes before the tanks are empty." 15 minutes. 180 people depending on me. No airport close enough, and a damaged aircraft that was becoming harder to control every second. It was official. We were facing the most dangerous situation any pilot can imagine. "Miami Center, 447 Heavy. We have multiple emergencies. Severe engine failure, cabin depressurization, and rapid fuel loss. We need the nearest available airport immediately. 447 Heavy, stand by. We're checking options. The nearest suitable airport is Key West, bearing 140 degrees, distance 160 nautical miles. 160 nautical miles. With our reduced speed due to damage and the need to fly on only one engine, that meant at least 35 minutes of flight time. But with our fuel leaking rapidly, we didn't have anywhere near that. Negative Miami Center, we don't have enough fuel for Key West. We need closer options. 447 Heavy, there's MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, bearing 080 degrees, distance 90 nautical miles. MacDill Air Force Base. A military installation with a runway long enough for a 767, but I'd never landed there and wasn't sure about approach procedures for civilian aircraft in emergency. What's the runway length at MacDill? I asked. 447 Heavy, runway is 0422, length 11,000 feet, military controlled. 11,000 feet. That was plenty of runway for a 767, even in an emergency. It was our best chance. 447 Heavy, requesting vectors to MacDill Air Force Base. While air traffic control gave us the new routing, I was doing desperate calculations in my head. With 90 nautical miles to cover, flying at about 250 knots in our emergency descent, we'd need approximately 25 minutes. But our fuel was leaking so rapidly that we had, at most, 15 minutes before the engines would start failing due to fuel starvation. It was mathematically impossible. Jake, run the engine failure and emergency descent checklist. I'm going to try to calculate if we can make it. Jake began working the procedures while I did math that didn't add up no matter how I calculated it. I always came to the same terrible conclusion. We didn't have enough fuel to reach MacDill. That's when I made one of the most difficult decisions of my career. If we couldn't reach an airport with the fuel we had, I needed to make that fuel last longer, and there was only one way to do that. Jake, I'm going to shut down the left engine. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Captain, you can't do that. It's our only functioning engine. Listen, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Running the numbers, we'll never reach MacDill with this fuel consumption, but if we shut down the left engine and glide, we can fly farther with the fuel we have. It was a strategy completely against everything we learned in training. You never, ever intentionally shut down your last functioning engine, but it was clear that following standard procedures would take us straight into the Gulf of Mexico. If we do this, we won't be able to make a normal approach, Jake said. It'll basically be a controlled crash. I know, but it's our only chance. I picked up the PA and made the most difficult announcement of my life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have experienced a serious emergency with one of our engines and are diverting to MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. I need everyone to listen carefully to the flight attendants and prepare for an emergency landing. Please remain calm, keep your seatbelts fastened, and follow all instructions. We are doing everything possible to get everyone safely on the ground. I could hear murmurs of panic and some people crying throughout the cabin. Sarah and her team immediately began preparing passengers for a possible emergency evacuation, explaining brace positions and reviewing emergency exits. Captain, Sarah said through the interphone, passengers are scared, but they're following instructions. We have some people feeling sick due to depressurization, but nothing serious so far. Perfect, Sarah. We need everyone to remain seated and prepared. It's going to be a rough landing. I turned my attention back to the flight situation. We were at 18,000 feet and descending. Our speed was controlled at 280 knots, and MacDill was now 80 nautical miles ahead. Miami Center 447 Heavy requesting direct vector to MacDill and declaring fuel emergency. We have approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining. 447 Heavy, turn left heading 080 degrees direct MacDill. We're coordinating with military authorities for emergency services to be standing by. It was time to make the riskiest decision of my life. Jake, I'm shutting down the left engine in now. I moved my hand to the left engine fuel control switch and turned it to the off position. Our aircraft's last functioning engine began to wind down until it stopped completely. Sudden silence. After an hour and 45 minutes of flight with the constant roar of engines, suddenly we were flying in almost total silence. Only the sound of air passing over the fuselage and the electronic noise of emergency systems running on power from the Ram air turbine, which had deployed automatically to generate electrical power with the loss of engines. Our 767, weighing approximately 120 tons, was now essentially a giant glider, flying at 280 knots at 15,000 feet altitude. MacDill Tower, American 447 Heavy, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We are a Boeing 767 with total engine failure approaching your airport, requesting emergency landing runway 04. We have 192 souls on board and are in emergency glide. American 447 Heavy, MacDill Tower, we copy your Mayday. Runway 04 in use, winds 090 degrees at 12 knots. Emergency services are standing by. You are cleared to land runway 04. 80 nautical miles to cover, 15,000 feet of altitude to lose, no engine power. I did quick calculations in my head. With our glide ratio, we could reach the runway, but it would be very, very tight. Jake, we're going to make it, but there won't be anything left over. I need you to prepare the cabin for impact and review emergency evacuation procedures. Captain, Jake said, his voice tense but focused, I calculated our descent rate. We'll reach the runway with about 500 feet of altitude. It'll work, but there won't be a second chance. He was right. With a normal glider, you have the luxury of making a gradual approach and adjusting your trajectory as needed. But with a 120-ton 767 without engines, you get exactly one attempt. If you missed the approach, there was no power to go around. The next contact with the ground would be final. Sarah, I called on the interphone, I need you to prepare the entire cabin for emergency landing. Brace positions in 5 minutes. Understood, Captain. We'll start preparation now. Throughout the cabin, I could hear Sarah and her team instructing passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for an emergency landing. Please remove all sharp objects from your pockets, remove your shoes, and assume the brace position when we announce. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing. I looked out the window and finally could see MacDill Air Force Base on the horizon. The military installation looked tiny in the middle of the Florida landscape. Our only chance of salvation was an 11,000-foot runway at a base I'd never landed at before. Visual with the runway, I announced. Jake, landing checklist emergency. We began running the emergency landing checklist, which was quite different from the normal procedure. Without engine power, many systems were operating only on emergency power. The flaps would have limited capability, the hydraulic system was operating only on residual pressure, and the landing gear would have to be lowered manually. Gear down, I commanded. Jake activated the landing gear lever, but the confirmation lights didn't illuminate immediately. Landing gear not confirming, he said. Use the manual procedure. Jake activated the emergency system to lower the landing gear manually. After some eternal seconds, we finally heard the characteristic noise of the gear extending and locking in position. 3 green, Jake confirmed. Landing gear down and locked. We were at 8,000 feet altitude and 40 nautical miles from the runway. Our speed was stable at 270 knots, and MacDill Air Force Base was growing rapidly ahead of us. Flaps 5, I commanded. With limited power, our flaps responded slowly, but we managed to extend to position 5. We wouldn't be able to use full landing configuration, but at least we'd have some additional lift to reduce our touchdown speed. Cabin crew, 2 minutes to landing. Assume brace positions. Throughout the cabin, 180 passengers were now in emergency position. heads down, hands protecting their necks, feet firm on the floor. It was a sight that gave me chills and at the same time filled me with determination. All these people trusted me to get them safely to the ground. MacDill Tower, 447 Heavy, final approach runway 04, requesting all emergency services standing by. 447 Heavy, all emergency services are in position. Wind 090 at 15 knots. You are cleared to land. 5,000 feet altitude, 20 miles from the runway. I could clearly see the airport now. The runway looked incredibly long for a 767, surrounded by military facilities and emergency vehicles lined up along the sides. It had to be perfect. "Captain," Jake said, "speed 250 knots, descent rate 1 to 800 feet per minute. Trajectory looks good." I concentrated all my attention on maintaining a stable approach. Without engines, I had no way to correct major errors. Every control input had to be smooth and precise. 3,000 feet altitude, 12 miles from the runway. "Flaps 15, I commanded. The flaps extended a bit more, giving us additional lift and allowing a lower approach speed. 2,000 feet, 6 miles. The runway was now clearly visible ahead. I could see the fire trucks positioned along the runway, ambulances waiting, emergency lights flashing. The entire base must have been watching our desperate approach. "Speed 220 knots, Jake announced. Trajectory slightly high. I was flying slightly above the ideal approach path. In a normal situation, this would be easily corrected with a small power reduction. But without engines, my only option was to point the nose slightly down to increase our descent rate. "Cabin crew, 1 minute to touchdown. Brace for impact." 1,000 feet, 2 miles from the runway. I could see we were perfectly aligned with the runway centerline. Our speed was stable at 210 knots, faster than normal for landing, but acceptable considering our emergency condition. 500 feet, 1 mile. "Captain, speed a bit high," Jake said. 200 knots. 200 knots was really fast for a landing, but it was what we had. With limited flaps and no possibility of going around, I had to accept a higher touchdown speed, 200 feet. I could clearly see the runway markings now. MacDill Air Force Base stretched out before us. Beyond the end of the runway, just more Florida landscape. 100 feet. "Brace, brace, brace!" I shouted over the PA. 50 feet. I gently lowered the nose, preparing for ground contact. 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet. The main landing gear touched the runway with a much harder impact than normal. Our 767 bounced once, then made definitive contact with the asphalt at 195 knots. "Maximum reverse!" I shouted. Although I knew we had no functioning reversers without engines, I stood on the brakes with all the force I had. Jake deployed the spoilers manually. Our aircraft was decelerating, but still very fast. We passed the 3,000-foot mark of the runway at 120 knots. 6,000 feet, still at 80 knots. 9,000 feet, 60 knots. With only 2,000 feet of runway remaining, we managed to bring our aircraft to a complete stop. Total silence in the cockpit for a few seconds. Then Jake looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Captain, we made it." I picked up the PA with trembling hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MacDill Air Force Base. Please remain seated while the cabin crew prepares for evacuation. You are all safe." The applause that came from the cabin was deafening. 180 people clapping, crying, laughing, hugging each other. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard in my life. Within minutes, we were executing the emergency evacuation. The slides were activated, and all 180 passengers were evacuated from the aircraft in less than 90 seconds. Nobody was seriously injured. Some minor scrapes during evacuation, some people in shock, but everyone alive. I was the last to leave the aircraft, as tradition demands. When I stepped onto the MacDill runway and looked back at our 767, I could finally see the real extent of the damage. The right engine was completely destroyed, with pieces scattered all over the wing. The fuselage had multiple perforations from explosion fragments. It was a miracle we'd been able to keep the aircraft flying for so long. Sarah came running toward me and gave me a tight hug. "Captain, thank you. You saved all of our lives." But I knew it hadn't been just me. It had been the entire crew working together. Jake, maintaining calm and executing all procedures perfectly. Sarah and the cabin crew keeping passengers calm and prepared. The air traffic control personnel guiding us to salvation. It had been teamwork. In the following days, we discovered what had caused the explosion. A rare failure in the high-pressure turbine disc of the right engine had resulted in an uncontained catastrophic failure. Engine fragments had punctured not only the fuselage but also damaged fuel lines in the wing, causing the leak that nearly cost us all our lives. Investigators told me that the decision to shut down the left engine and glide had been crucial to our survival. With normal consumption of the functioning engine plus the fuel leak, we never would have reached MacDill. The glide had given us exactly the extra minutes we needed. 3 months later, I received a call from the airline's CEO. "Bob, I want you to know that your decision saved 192 lives. The entire company recognizes your courage and technical competence. We have a proposal for you." I thought it might be some kind of promotion or formal recognition. "We want you to lead our new emergency management training program, teaching other pilots how to make difficult decisions under extreme pressure." It was a tempting offer, but after what I'd been through, I knew what I really wanted to do. "I really appreciate the offer, but I'm actually thinking about retiring. I want to spend more time with my family." I flew for 6 more months after the incident, but my heart wasn't in the cockpit the same way. Every time I heard any abnormal noise from the engines, my mind went back to that terrible moment over the Gulf of Mexico. It was time to stop. I retired at the end of that year, after 26 years as a commercial pilot. Now I spend my days teaching simulator classes to young pilots, teaching not just technical procedures, but also the importance of staying calm and making decisions based on rational analysis, even when everything seems to be going wrong. A week after our emergency landing, I received a letter that made me cry. It was from Jessica, one of the high school students who was on the exchange trip to Miami. "Captain Mitchell, I want you to know that your example inspired me to study aeronautical engineering. Someday I want to design even safer aircraft so that other pilots like you can save even more lives. Thank you for showing me that with knowledge, courage and teamwork, we can overcome any challenge. It's because of letters like that that I know it's worth dedicating a lifetime to aviation." Today, whenever I pass by an airport and see a 767 taking off, I can't help but think about those 15 minutes over the Gulf of Mexico. 15 minutes that tested everything I learned in 4 decades of flying. 15 minutes that could have ended very differently if a single decision had been made wrong. Aviation is a profession that doesn't forgive errors, but rewards knowledge, preparation, and the ability to stay calm when everything is going wrong. That day, all the hours of training, all the simulators, all the emergencies I practiced over the years became real, and they worked. Sometimes people ask me if I was afraid during those 15 critical minutes. The honest answer is, yes, I was very afraid. Afraid of not being able to save all those passengers. Afraid of disappointing the families who were waiting for their loved ones to arrive in Miami. Afraid that my career would end with a tragedy. But training is stronger than fear. When you train the same emergency hundreds of times, your muscles develop memory. Your hands know where the controls are even in the dark. Your mind processes information and makes decisions even when your heart is racing. That's what saved us that day. It wasn't luck. It was preparation meeting opportunity at the most critical moment. Jake continued flying and became a captain 2 years later. Whenever we meet at aviation events, he jokes that he was the only first officer in history to see his captain intentionally shut down the last functioning engine of the aircraft. And it actually worked, he laughs. Sarah also continued flying and is now a cabin crew training supervisor. She always says the day changed her perspective on how important the cabin crew is in emergencies. It doesn't matter if the pilots know how to fly if the passengers panic, she often says. We're all one team. MacDill Air Force Base became a special place for all of us. 3 years after the incident, the airline organized a trip for the entire crew and some passengers to return to the base for a Thanksgiving ceremony. It was emotional to step on that runway again, but this time as guests, not as someone fighting for life. The base personnel received us as heroes. The air traffic controller who guided us that day, Staff Sergeant Mike Johnson, showed us recordings of our approach. "You guys don't know," he said, "but it was the most perfect approach I've ever seen. No engines, on a military runway, with crosswinds. It was like watching a miracle." During our visit, we met several base personnel who had watched our desperate landing 3 years before. Many said they'd never forget seeing that big white plane descending silently from the sky, without engine noise, like a large wounded bird looking for a safe place to land. One thing people always ask me is if I would change anything about that day. After much reflection, I believe we made all the right decisions within the circumstances we faced. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, maybe we could have identified the fuel leak a few minutes earlier or tried a different flap configuration for landing. But in the heat of the moment, with limited information and time running out, we did the best we could. The official investigation concluded that our crew acted with exceptional competence in the face of multiple simultaneous emergencies, and that the unconventional decisions made by the captain were instrumental in preventing a greater tragedy. The report became study material in aviation schools worldwide, but for me, the real recognition came 2 years later in a supermarket in Dallas. A lady approached me timidly. "Excuse me for bothering you, but aren't you Captain Mitchell, from the flight that made the emergency landing?" "Yes, that's me. I was on that flight with my 8-year-old grandson. It was his first airplane trip. After what happened, I thought he'd never want to fly again. But you know what he told me? That when he grew up, he wanted to be a pilot like you. That he had seen how you saved everyone and wanted to do the same thing." She paused for a moment with tears in her eyes. "My grandson is now at the Air Force Academy. He always says he was inspired by you that day. Thank you for saving our lives, and thank you for inspiring a new generation of pilots. It's for moments like that that I know I chose the right profession." Aviation isn't just about transporting people from one place to another. It's about responsibility, about carrying dreams and hopes, about being the guardian of the trust that passengers place in you every time they board an aircraft. Today, when I teach young pilots in the simulator, I always tell the story of Flight AA447. Not to brag or to scare, but to show that impossible situations can be overcome with preparation, teamwork, and especially the courage to make difficult decisions when there are no easy options. I always end my class with the same phrase: "I hope you never have to face a situation like this, but if you do, I hope you remember that every problem has a solution. Sometimes the solution isn't in the manual, sometimes you need to think outside the box, but there's always a way to protect the lives that are under your responsibility." Aviation taught me that we're not just pilots, we're temporary guardians of precious lives, and that responsibility doesn't end when we shut down the engines. It stays with us forever. When I look back at those 15 minutes that changed my life, I don't feel pride or trauma. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for having had the necessary training to face the situation. Gratitude for the exceptional crew that worked with me. Gratitude for the controllers who guided us to salvation. And especially gratitude for having lived to tell this story and inspire others to follow in aviation. Life presents us with moments that define who we really are. For some, these moments happen in war, for others in natural disasters, for still others in operating rooms saving lives. For me, it happened at 35,000 feet over the Gulf of Mexico, with 180 people depending on my decisions. That day, I discovered that training, experience, and teamwork can overcome any adversity. I discovered that even in the most desperate situations, there's always a solution if you stay calm and think creatively. And I discovered that the responsibility of protecting human lives is the greatest privilege any professional can have. If you're thinking about pursuing a career in aviation, know that it's not just a job, it's a calling. It's accepting that from time to time you may be called to make decisions that will affect not only your life, but the lives of hundreds of people who trusted you to take them safely home. It's a heavy responsibility, but it's also the most rewarding profession in the world. Because every time you land an aircraft safely, you're reuniting families, fulfilling dreams, connecting people across the world. And if one day you find yourself in a situation like I faced, remember, you were trained for this. Trust your training, work with your team, stay calm, and there will always be a solution. Aviation is about flying, but mainly it's about coming home safely. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales from the skies, subscribe to the Black Box channel. We have many other stories of courage, overcoming challenges, and the daily struggles of those who work to keep aviation safe. Leave your comment telling us what story you'd like to hear in the next episode, and don't forget to share with someone who's also passionate about aviation. Until the next flight.